Hey everyone, it's Jim Cohn. This is not a proper episode of my podcast, Circle of Willis. It's a bonus episode, I guess. By which I mean to say, I'm not really sure what else to call it. It's sort of like the extras you get on a DVD or something like that. I think I'm gonna do this sort of thing occasionally. What happened is, so after Lisa and I recorded our first conversation, we got to chatting about how she started studying emotion and what it was like for her to sort of buck the dominant view of what emotions were. And we realized, shit, we should record this too. We didn't have much time, but we switched on the recorder and continued to chat more or less as we had been. So now you get to hear Lisa describe not only what she knows, but a bit more about her, her process. How pulling on various scientific threads led her to the study of emotion, and then to, neuroscience, and then to, the philosophy of science, and then to the sociology of science, and on with her. She's like that. And she'll also relate some, to my mind, pretty shocking reactions to her work earlier on in her career, which I won't talk about here. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna stop yammering on and get right to the interview. So, folks, here's some more Lisa Feldman Barrett. How did you get to the point where I'm sure this is a much more complicated story, and we could go on for another whole hour to talk about this, but I know that you started out in life as a clinical psychologist, right? You were studying clinical psychology in graduate school. Did you get a clinical degree?
I did, yeah.
Did you do internship and all of that stuff?
Oh, absolutely.
Did you get licensed?
I came very short of getting licensed.
Yeah.
But I did. I worked as a clinic assistant in graduate school, which meant that I was not only seeing my own clients, but also supervising other graduate students. And then I did a clinical internship. My first job was as an assistant professor in clinical psychology. So for 4 years, I was in a clinical area. I saw patients. I taught clinical assessment, which I loved, actually.
Uh-huh.
And I wrote my licensing exam. And I came very short of, I had all my hours logged and everything to be licensed, but then I decided to give it up. I just decided to focus to move out of clinical psychology and focus on research.
Wow. So emotion is obviously relevant to clinical psychology in a bunch of different ways. But how does one go from, you weren't studying emotion initially, right? What were you studying then?
So I entered graduate school. So first of all, I should say, I thought I would go to medical school.
Uh-huh.
And so I was really focused on going to medical school. And my undergraduate research advisor in psychology, I was working in several psychology labs to get research experience.
Yeah.
And my psychology advisor at that time said, listen, I just want you to apply to a couple of graduate schools too. And so I was like, oh, okay. So I applied only to two, actually.
2 grad schools?
That's it, just 2.
In Boston?
No, I didn't. I lived in Toronto at the time.
Oh, right.
So I applied to the University of Toronto to do cognitive psychology with Dan Schachter.
Nice.
Because I took a course from him.
Yeah.
And clinical psychology at the University of Waterloo, which was just the next
down the road
town over, because it was the top ranked clinical program in the country.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay,
that's
my
good.
2.
Yeah.
And then somewhere along the way of my senior year, I realized I love doing research, love, because it was my first real opportunity to do my own research, right?
Yeah.
And I was watching all my friends go to medical school, because in Canada, you can go to medical school after your second or third year of university. So all of my friends were starting, medical school. And I was like, I don't want to be told. I just didn't want to be told what to do. And I really, I so much don't like being told what to do that I can't even follow a recipe, seriously. And I don't know, I guess was watching what they were doing, and while I thought that the science was interesting, it seemed to me that they weren't learning science as a process. They were learning
generating
science.
science.
They were learning. They were consumers of science.
Right,
They were
that's right.
learning science as a body of facts,
Right.
which I found uninteresting. Actually,
Yeah,
I really
yeah.
wanted to pursue the generative side of science, and so I had only applied to 2 graduate schools. I got into both. And I went into clinical because Dan Schechter was moving to the University of Arizona. And so really the decision was made for me.
Wow.
And so I started graduate school, and I was very interested in the self. That, in fact, I just just a few moments ago, at the annual meeting of the Association for Psychological Science, I introduced Hazel Marcus, who won the William James Award,
Right.
which is the highest
It's
honor, basically.
just about the best it can get.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that one of the first papers I read in graduate school was Hazel's paper on her 1977 paper on the self as a cognitive schema.
Yeah, wow.
So that was really...
So that also set you up a little bit for a kind of world view.
Yeah, well, I think, we could talk about my own developmental history and what set me up to be a constructionist, or take more constructionist views of things. But I also have always had an abiding interest in biology, and I was very interested in anatomy, really, since high school. I took my first anatomy course in high school, and I'm very interested in physiology and genetics. And so I've always read a lot in those fields, kind of outside, psychology. And when I was in graduate school, the first research that I was doing was really more about the self, but it required the use of self-report measures of emotion, which were not behaving themselves in the way
here's where it gets started.
So they weren't, and so my first 8 experiments in psychology in graduate school failed. I failed to replicate 8 times. I failed to replicate published findings.
Ouch.
And my first thought was, clearly I'm not cut out to be a scientist. And luckily I was doing very well in my clinical training. And so I thought, okay, I'll just do that.
I'll
just see clients. I'll have exactly. I'll have a nice office. It'll be, I'll have nice furniture. I'll be able to,
Go back to Toronto.
Yeah, it'll be fine. But then when I started to look into my data a little more, so I was always, as I said, I think I've always been kind of a tenacious person, and I don't take failure lightly. And I decided to look through my data very carefully. And when I did, I realized I may have been failing to replicate published findings, but I was replicating myself again and again and again. And the finding that I had was that people were not distinguishing between anxiety and depression or fear and sadness, which are supposed to be very different emotions. So I thought, having been schooled in, I wasn't trained, to study emotion, but I had read, enough in psychology to know that, Darwin said that there were facial expressions that were diagnostic, one for each emotion. And William James supposedly said that, each emotion had its own bodily pattern. So it should be really easy to just objectively measure how people feel, what state they're in. And then I could compare that to their ratings, and I could determine who was accurate and who wasn't. And then I could maybe teach the people who were not accurate to be accurate. And this seemed like, reasonable thing to do. So I thought that this would be I would just solve the problem of the measurement problem in my studies of the self. And in the meantime, I would also, start to figure out who's accurately aware of their experiences and who isn't, and just teach the people who are.
So you're assuming that there's a objective.
Yeah, well, sure, because we all assumed that.
Yeah,
because that's what all the papers said.
Yep.
That's what all the textbooks said. That's what that was the classical view. What did I know? And so I started to look for the objective markers of these emotions, and I realized over a number of years that they don't exist.
So you started pulling on a thread.
I started to pull on a thread.
Yeah.
First, I thought, well, Darwin said, that we pout when we're sad and scowl when we're angry. So that must obviously be true. Let me see if it is. And then I'll learn how to measure muscle movements on the face. And it turns out that Darwin didn't exactly say what everybody claims him to have said. But some of the things he did say actually in this book contradicted his most well-known book on the origin of species, which had a number of conceptual innovations in that book, which were absent in the expression of the emotions in men and animals, which I found interesting and compelling, actually. And so I just started to dig in really much more deeply into the literature on the face. And then I realized, well, there are no real markers for facial expressions of anger, sadness, fear, and so on that are where each emotion has its own single marker, or even a family of closely physically similar markers that anyone's ever actually scientifically verified in actual moving faces. And I thought, okay, well, but at least there's the physiology. So we all know what William James said, and of course, when you read really closely, you find out William James actually really didn't say that. And also the data don't support it. So, we have been in my lab, we're just, I hope, at the end of a very long multi-year process of publishing a meta-analysis, the most comprehensive meta-analysis of the peripheral physiology of emotion, showing absolutely there are no patterns. And so when I realized that, of course, I had to learn psychophysiology first, and then I learned, so first I read and I couldn't find the evidence, and then I was trained in psychophysiology with the help of several colleagues, and then realized after I started running my own studies too that there are no physical fingerprints. So then I thought, okay, well, the brain's, everyone kept saying, well, it's in the brain. So I thought, okay, well, I have to become a neuroscientist now. So that's what I did. And I started to read, I had already been reading anatomy and so on, but I started to more seriously study neuroanatomy and brain imaging, and then reading, of course, track tracing studies in animals and other kinds of research.
And you're publishing along the way. You're sort
Yeah.
of going through all of this as in writing papers along the way. And I don't know this for sure. I don't know if I've ever actually asked you this specifically before. Maybe because I've always assumed it, but I would have found it frightening to take the positions that you've taken, especially as early as the 90s, the mid 90s.
It was really challenging. I, as a woman,
Yeah,
and as someone who was challenging the status quo,
very dominant alpha male kinds of folks.
Yeah, and some people who have a lot invested in the classical view, a lot financially invested,
Yeah.
a lot of their career invested.
Yeah.
And so, but for me, I just was really curious. I just was really curious to understand how it was, first of all, that I can feel angry or sad or afraid or gratitude or awe or happiness or compassion in a way. I feel these things effortlessly and automatically. I can look at someone and instantly have a sense of how they feel, but yet no scientist can find a biological marker for any of these categories.
How would that happen?
How could that happen? And what it did was it led me to be really interested in the nature of biological categories. So what is a biological category? If emotions certainly are mental categories, psychological, but they're also, everything is a biological category too, right? And so
if you slice fine enough.
Yeah. So and that led me to become interested just in much more in philosophy of science and how we map observations to ideas. And it also led me to be really interested in kind of the sociology of science, of why were people getting so upset? Like, what is it? Why? At first I thought, let me just back up and say this. There was I talk about this in my book. I had one instance where one of our colleagues came up to me after I had given a particularly provocative talk, and so deeply believed that anger was so deeply believed in the classical view of anger that he threatened to punch me in the face as evidence of what real anger looked like.
Oh my God.
Right. I had another colleague of ours, kind of in a relationally aggressive way, tell me that obviously I'd never felt real fear in my life because I couldn't recognize it when I saw it. So would I like to have an experience that would,
Oh my God.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are only 2 examples out of, 25 years of giving talks. But in those moments, I thought, I think that something is keeping people really anchored to this view, something more than just their careers. Because a lot of these guys are scientists. We're all scientists. We're all really curious about stuff. What we're curious about may differ, but so what is it that would be so important that would curtail someone's curiosity? What would that be? And I realized at that point that maybe it was something even more important than your career. Maybe it was their ideas about what it meant to be human.
Yeah, that's pretty important.
And so there was a part of me that was just driven by the curiosity to know. And, I don't think that the conflict, and I don't like conflict I don't like interpersonal conflict, but I also don't let it stop me from following the science as far as I can follow it. So, sometimes people ask me like, wasn't it really hard for you? And the answer is it was hard actually at times. And it was hard to have people make attributions about the reason for doing something that was, sometimes not flattering. And, but the real answer to the question of why I just kept pulling on that string was I was just really curious. And as a clinician, I was always really most intrigued with people when they were contradicting themselves, because in clinical science, when someone contradicts themselves, they say one thing and then in the same breath, they say something else, which is a contradiction. You know that there's some self-deception there somewhere. You don't know what it is. You don't know where it is. You don't know why, but that's the moment where you, as a clinician, you kind of zero in on that little thread and you pull, to see what you're going to get to be helpful to the person. Right. And I think the same kind of thing probably applies here. I saw an inconsistency and I just wasn't willing to let it go because I was just too curious to try to understand what were all the reasons why this inconsistency was being maintained.
I think that's so fascinating. That is so fascinating to me. And there's one specific thing. I mean, this isn't at all about me, but during that time when I'm first discovering your sort of journey through exploring these inconsistencies, my minor in my PhD is in measurement. And I'm having all of these almost physical sensations that were very unpleasant when I'm thinking about applying what I'm learning in measurement to the stuff that I'm studying, because there were so many problems. And there were many of the problems, the same problems that you were seeing in writing, as we just discovered mutually later on. But I could not take the next step. I couldn't, I just was like, maybe I was still in the, this is about me not quite understanding how it all fits together, because I couldn't just accept that the problem might be with the concepts or the constructs that we were working with.
Yeah, I guess I took those. I actually never had a course in measurement theory. I taught a course in measurement theory.
Oh, those are rare. Good for you.
When I was a graduate student, actually, one of my was to teach an undergraduate course in measurement theory, and I had partially some exposure to measurement theory in a course on assessment, which I had taken and then later taught.
That's where most people get some exposure.
But I found it incredibly fascinating because, of course, there's serious philosophy of science that underlies classical measurement theory.
It's huge.
And I just found that really interesting. And I took many statistics courses, and even now, for example, I have weekly meetings with these engineers who have very patiently over a number of years taught me enough math that I can understand some of the philosophical and scientific assumptions that are being made in order to make the math easier and computationally tractable. And it's hugely problematic, actually.
Oh, it can be for sure. Yeah.
So that's been really fun to do. But I guess I've just always found puzzles and, fun. And I the idea that things aren't quite as they seem, aren't as they appear to be.
Yeah.
Also, I've just always found that really captivating. And I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm a glutton for punishment. Maybe at some moments I think, well, I can always do something else if this doesn't work out,
Yeah.
But mainly, I think my curiosity. I love science too much, really, to ever really leave it. The idea of being able to understand how things work is just incredibly. It's an incredible gift to be able to live that kind of life.
When I think about students, and one of the hardest things it is to train, and one of the hardest things it is to learn, and that I don't know about you, but I continuously relearn over and over again throughout my career, is learning to make the distinction between what I really think about a thing and what I'm sort of expected to think or what everybody else thinks.
Yeah, I don't think I have that issue. I think one of the things I always tell my students is, don't bother with introductions and discussion sections of papers. Just read the final paragraph. I mean, you have to read those sections when you're just learning a field, because you have to understand what the concepts are, what are the terms, how are people using them.
Context, history.
But in my experience, history is super important, which our students don't get enough of, I think. I have more to say about that, about the intersection between the history of science and philosophy of science. But, I'm obviously not the first to have those thoughts. But I think that in my experience, oftentimes what the data show in the results section doesn't match what the discussion section says.
Yeah.
In ways that I find continually perplexing, either because there are errors of omission, which there almost always are, or errors of commission from my perspective. So I actually always caution my students to not take anybody's word for it, even mine. They should read the method section and the results section and determine for themselves what they think it says.
Yeah. And that's not trivial, to really sit down and think, what do I really think?
Right. And
what do I think is true?
And I guess for me, for whatever reason, you could probably come up with all kinds of psychodynamic reasons for this. Whenever I have one of my own assumptions violated, my reaction is like, that is so cool. Right? It's not like, oh my God, the very foundation of my life is over. I'm sure that there are things where, there are instances where my assumptions are violated. I would feel like it was catastrophic, but I don't think they have to do with science. They have more to do with my personal life and my assumptions about certain people and what their importance is to me. I think in science, my reaction has always been, that is incredibly cool. And I just gravitate to instances where my own expectations or assumptions are violated. I just think it's really cool.
The magic of the failed hypothesis. All right, Lisa, thanks again.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You could always hold that one good thought, and that one good thought saw you through, hovering above the life you grew. You discovering there's nothing wrong with you. He'll always say that's what you did.